Prospects 2014, 5 years after the global financial crisis, the world economy is showing signs of bouncing back this year, pulled along by a recovery in high-income economies, says the World Bank's latest global economic prospects. Developing countries' growth is also forming, thanks in part to the recovery in high-income economies as well as the moderating ones. Growth prospects for 2014 are, however, sensitive to the tapering of monetary stimulus in the United States, which began earlier this month, and to the structural shifts taking place in China's economy. Global economic indicators show improvement, but one does not have to be especially astute to see there are dangers that lurk beneath the surface. Inclusive growth represents growth that generates decent jobs, gives opportunities for all segments of society, especially socially excluded groups, and distributes the income and non-income gains from prosperity more equally across the society. Inclusive growth, while requiring poverty reduction, is a broader concept that also focuses on reducing inequalities and different forms of discrimination, including widespread exclusion and unequal access to growth benefits of women and girls. Sustained economic growth, in the sense of dynamic, enduring, or self-propelling growth, requires structural and especially technological change, that is, the ability of an economy to constantly generate new fast-growing activities characterized by higher value added and productivity. Industrial development has been historical and continues to be, for most countries, an important phase of their growth process, especially in the transition from predominantly agricultural economies. With this, may I now take the honor of introducing our Vice Chairman, Mr. Shishir Japuria, to the audience. Mr. Shishir Japuria, BCom LLB, is an eminent industrialist having more than 24 years of experience in managing companies. Mr. Japuria is the Managing Director of Guinea Filaments Limited and is also Vice Chairman of Seth Anandram Japuria Education Society. Presently, Mr. Japuria is Chairman of Textiles and Technical Textiles Committee, FICCI, Director of National Skill Development Corporation, Managing Committee Member of PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and past Chairman of Confederation of Indian Textile Industry, Northern India Textile Research Association, and President of Northern India Textile Mills Association. Sir, may I now request...
Esteemed guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, and dear students, on behalf of the Japuria Group of Management Institutions, I am very pleased to welcome you to the International Conference on Changing Global Economic Perspectives, Managing Sustained and Inclusive Growth. I have great pleasure in welcoming Mr. B.K. Chaturvedi, Member, Planning Commission, Government of India, as the chief guest of the conference. Sri Chaturvedi, as Cabinet Secretary, worked at the head of all the civic services in India. He is a multifaceted personality with rich and varied experience in government and the corporate world. He has been Secretary to the Government of India in several ministries, including Finance, Human Resource Development, which includes higher education, technical education and elementary education, and petroleum and natural gas. Mr. Chaturvedi is also a recipient of Padma Bhushan for his outstanding contribution to the society. Sir, we are indeed privileged to have you with us today, and thank you for sparing your time for this conference and being the chief guest. We are also privileged to have Professor Arun Kumar from the Center of Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to join us as the guest of honor for this conference. Professor Kumar has rich experience on areas like public finance, growth economics, macroeconomics, and development economics. There is no doubt that his presence and presentation will enlighten us on the latest position on the theme of the conference. I am especially honored to welcome you, sir. Global economy and its impact has been a subject of discussion in different forums across the world, and every nation, developed or developing, likes to keep a close watch on the changing global economic landscape. In the economic context, no country can operate its programs and policies in isolation, and decisions taken by one sovereign nation does affect others in the region. Also, if the nation is economically highly developed, it has the capacity to create tremors worldwide. This, therefore, creates a mandate for all economists, policymakers, researchers, and indeed politicians in power to keep abreast of the changing global trends and make suitable adjustments in their own policies and strategies so that their country can progress. We have witnessed that in the year 2009-10, the Fed's launch of quantitative easing led to flood of inflows of cheap money in emerging markets. It propped up equity, bond and currency market in the developing countries. Money flowed despite lower growth prospects and structural deficiencies. Speculation about possible tapering of the same and at the same time improving economic data in the United States have paved way for reverse flow of funds back into the United States. For example, by September 1, 2013, the currencies in India and Brazil have fallen by 15%, and the stock market in other countries, including Indonesia and Turkey, have also got a beating. It is equally important to mention that much of the current turmoil in the number of emerging markets is due to the deteriorating economic fundamentals. Primarily, higher current account deficits, entrenched inflationary pressure, and deteriorating public finance. However, if emerging markets can address these internal issues, then the long-term prospects for the emerging markets look attractive. While at the global level, there are concerns about the population increase, poverty, hunger and health issues, every country inevitably formulates its own policy to meet its own specific needs. This is understandable. However, the integration of the global economy and the issues that affect the entire world or a large part of the globe needs to be addressed in a joint manner. This is absolutely necessary, especially when we talk about sustainability and management of sustained growth. Issues of environmental protection, depleting natural resources, uncontrolled industrial pollution, and corresponding climatical changes will become extremely relevant. They all have a cost, and a huge cost, which will affect every nation across the globe. For example, we have not done a serious study on the long-term economic cost resulted from global warming. We at international forums must discuss these issues and resolve to take corrective action before it is too late. Another burning issue that is subsumed in the topic of the conference relates to the urgent need for inclusive growth. I think, first of all, we need to define the parameters of inclusive growth. Involve everyone, including those who are being sought to be included, and debate on the different modes and methodologies of inclusion. For instance, we in our own country have started talking about inclusive growth and have started spending huge funds, which mainly goes in the form of subsidies. We need to ask ourselves whether it is the best strategy for inclusion, or could creation of appropriate infrastructure and providing opportunities to millions of people in the poverty zone could have been a better option and would have empowered them on a long-term basis. Economy and economic issues are absolutely dynamic in nature, and unlike science or mathematical puzzles, there is no specific answer to a problem. Politics, cultural diversity, availability of natural resources, levels of skill and education all play an important part in the economic strength and growth of a nation. Additionally, every country seeks to protect its own people, its industry, from unrestricted economic invasion from outside. Important things, however, is that we need to constantly engage ourselves in a dialogue with our own people and the decision makers to get a clear perspective of the changing trends. That will help us to formulate our economic policies and reorientate our strategies for maximum productivity and growth. I sincerely hope that this two-day conference, apart from clarifying the understanding of the perspectives of the global trend, will also suggest certain well-defined strategies or policy initiatives that need to be taken for managing a sustained and inclusive growth. I am extremely grateful to all the participants who have come here from far and wide, and do hope that they will enjoy the participation and contribute to the success of this conference. My special thanks once again to the Chief Guest and the Guest of Honor for gracing the occasion. I take this opportunity to express my hope that this conference will be an important step in our efforts to bring in new dimensions to the quality of management education. Once again, let me welcome you all to the Jaipuria Institute of Management. We look forward to learn from your discussions and deliberations. Thank you.
Enlightening words. May I now introduce our very own director, Dr. Narang. A thorough management professional, Professor Dr. Davinder Narang has been working with Jaipuria Institute of Management, Ghaziabad, as a professor and director. He has a rich experience of 18 years in the field of academics and management. He has also worked on a World Bank supported project on capacity building in Ethiopia for 2 years. Dr. Narang is a double postgraduate degree in both business economics and finance and control. He is a PhD in economics, and his contribution to research focuses on the banking efficiency in India. He is also associated with business firms as a corporate trainer on various financial modules. May I invite Dr. Narang to deliver the inaugural address.
Honorable Mr. B.K. Chaturvedi, respected Mr. Arun Kumar, respected Mr. Shishir Jaipuria, our mentor Mr. Vinod Malhotra, conference participants, academicians, fellow colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you. I, Professor Davinder Narang, Director, Jaipuria Institute of Management, is pleased to give a very warm welcome on this international conference on changing global economic perspective, managing sustained and inclusive growth. This conference is another leap forward by Jaipuria Institute of Management in continuation of our preceding conference on challenges of maintenance and sustenance and growth in the era of economic downturn held in April 2012. This conference aims to understand challenges in managing sustenance and growth in global economic conditions and to get a conglomerative and exhaustive view from academia, corporate sector, government institutions, policymakers, and international agencies to come out with possible solutions and extend concrete recommendations on the diversified area facing the economic challenges. The issues underlying the themes of this present international conference are: in the current global economic scenario of high volatility, what should the stand of Indian economy? Second, despite the state efforts to sustain a projected growth, to what extent it is being achieved in reality? Financial markets, which are playing a vital role in propelling the economy towards inclusive growth, are they really able to achieve yields as expected in dwindling global trends? The financial market conditions have improved noticeably for the last half an year but the real economy still continues to the lag. Many developed economies are caught in downwards spelling dynamics from the high unemployment, weak aggregate demand compounded by the fiscal deficit, high public debt burden, and financial fragility. The economic woes of the developed country are spilling over to the developing country and economies in transition through weaker demand for their export and high volatility in capital flows and the commodity price. The prospects for the next 2 years continue to be challenging, fraught with major uncertainty and risk stands towards the downside. The reports of IMF forecast that world economy is strengthening, but it is happening by very small degree. World growth is also reached at 3.3% in 2013, yet final figure has to be come. Though it is expected it may improve slightly to 4% in 2014. However, the reports of the 2013 suggest a slow pace of real growth, underlying the downside risk of the global growth. The latest statistics on Indian growth and external positions were, though slightly welcome news, but in the second quarter of the current fiscal year, growth was slightly stronger than the expected at 4.8% year-on-year, and the current account deficit narrowed sharply. This mild improvement confirmed that states' recent measures to deal with deteriorating economic and financial environment were effective, although the risks are still high in terms of growth and external financing. Even so, the country's structural weaknesses are still intact and there is still the risk of sovereign rating downgrading. Moving towards the published record, it is noteworthy that the second quarter of the current financial fiscal year, GDP growth rebounded slightly 4.8 as a 6% increase in annual rate compared to the previous year versus 3.1% in the quarter before that. This slightly acceleration is mainly due to the dynamic momentum of the agriculture sector. The rebound in the financial services are also fueled to the upturns in the growth, but is unlikely to persist. Although on the superficial level, one may be optimistic towards the Indian growth projection, yet some notable facts need to be envisaged and with the gravity. Domestic demands, in contrast, remains sluggish, which is a key indicator of lack in economy and financial consolidation. Although household consumption and the corporate investment rose while government spending is declining. A recovery in the investment is the key restoring sustainable growth, despite the satisfying result of PMI survey that upturns in industrial production is still very fragile. Production of capital and consumer goods continue to be contract, although trends are looking slightly more upbeat for order in both the domestic and export market. They do not foreshadow a strong rebound in the private investment. Moreover, public investment projects are likely to be delayed or spread out over time due to budget overruns. Inflation and changing monetary conditions are the main source of the risk sustaining growth in the domestic market. The central bank governor has made combating inflation his top priority, yet wholesale and consumer price continue to rise very sharply. In addition to raising the key rates, they already have been raised twice since September, the central bank could continue to scale back its money market intervention as it has for the past several weeks in order to drive up real interest rate. A liquidity squeeze could strain this recovery. Moreover, from a more structural perspective, private investment seem to be increasing, restricted by a decline in the capital productivity. Along with increasing liquidity, structural reforms are thus indispensable to support the private investment. Investment could accelerate slightly following the next general election, given the number of projects that have been suspended for the next 6 months. India's external position is also one of its main weaknesses. The country has a structural current account deficit. In any case, the current account deficit should also be limited to 3% in GDP in 2013-14. Balance of payment pressure should diminish in the quarter ahead with the decline in the current account deficit. However, in the light of recent foreign withdrawal trends, the country is still particularly vulnerable to the capital outflow. Making growth more inclusive and addressing widespread poverty is another key area challenges for India. It requires sustained investment in people, starting from health and education, but also transport and energy infrastructure. It also requires a review of the poverty reduction program. With the engrossing adversity due to the global economic pull-down, we need to be more vigilant towards identifying and selecting the right course of action to drive the economy towards a concrete growth and consolidation path. I hope that by the culmination of this event, we would be able to draw certain conclusive measures to face the current challenges and those lying ahead. I, once again, on behalf of the Jaipurian Institute of Management, would welcome you all again towards our small step for a big leap. Thank you very much.
For discussing all those facts which clearly indicate the need for this conference. It is my great privilege to introduce our guest of honor, Professor Dr. Arun Kumar. Professor Dr. Arun Kumar has done MSc Physics from Delhi University and Princeton University, USA. Thereafter, he did PhD Economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His areas of interest include public finance, growth economics, macroeconomics, and development economics. Professor Kumar has worked at NIPFP and has been teaching at JNU since 1984. He has won several awards and fellowships. He has visited international universities for collaborations and consultations. Professor Kumar has contributed to the area of economic studies by publishing a number of research papers in renowned national and international journals. May I request Professor Dr. Kumar to kindly say a few words. Sir, please.
Inviting me here to make my presentation. Mr. Chaturvedi, Mr. Jaipuria, Mr. Malhotra, Mr. Naran, distinguished members of the audience, the students and the faculty of the institute, and I must mention the principal who is here from the school also in front of us. I make this presentation in a few sections. I look at the Indian economy, and then I look at the global economy and some of the philosophical aspects of the global economy, and then come down to the conclusions regarding sustainability and regarding the inclusive growth in the world economy. So I begin by talking about the Indian economic situation, and the first point I want to make is that the situation is full of contradictions. We have growth, but we also have rising inequality in the economy. The growth is slowing down across all sectors, as my second slide shows. If you look at across all sectors for the last 10 quarters, the growth of the GDP, the growth of different sectors has all slowed down with some ups and downs. And that's not a very healthy sign that the economy has been slowing down in this manner. The second aspect is that, do we know what the problem is? Yes, indeed, we know what the problem is. but the solution that we think will create the solution for the problem has become the problem itself. So the solution is the problem. So in other words, the steps that the government has taken of cutting down the fiscal deficit has itself created the problem of shortage of demand. So how have we cut our fiscal deficit? We have cut the plan size 3 years back by about 85,000 crores, 2 years back by about 1 lakh crore, and last year by about 1,30,000 crores. So in other words, we've had a cut of about 3,20,000 crores in terms of the size of the plan, and that then creates a problem because today private sector facing shortage of demand is not investing enough. Private sector has 2.5 lakh crores of investable reserve which it is not investing. Foreign direct investment is slowed down. Therefore, the only source of demand that remains is the public sector. And public sector, in the presence of cut in the fiscal deficit, through the cut in the plan, has got reserves of 3 lakh crores which it is not investing. So in other words, the public sector has 3 lakh crores of reserves, the private sector has 2.5 lakh crores of reserves which are not getting invested because our demand is short. The investment rate of the economy, which had peaked in 2007-8 at about 37%, has come down to about 33%. The savings rate has also come down, and unless we raise the investment and savings rate, the problem will not get resolved. So the question is, why are we cutting the fiscal deficit? And the reason we are cutting the fiscal deficit is because there is an external orientation of the policy. We are looking at what the credit rating agencies are saying, whether they downgrade the Indian economy. We are also looking at what the IMF is saying and so on. So our focus is on the outside, and for the outside, fiscal deficit is a very key indicator of the imbalance in the economy, along with the current account deficit. And I think Mr. Devender Narang has made my task simple by giving you a background of what's going on in the macro economy. So he pointed out the current account deficit is very high, inflation has been persistently high. And I must point out that the inflation rate given by the government is not a correct inflation rate because it uses WPI, the wholesale price index, as a measure. But WPI does not incorporate services, and our economy now has 65% of the services sector. So the WPI only represents 35% of the economy. And that's why, even though the government says the rate of inflation coming down, but the people feel the rate of inflation hasn't come down because education prices may rise, health prices may rise, housing prices may rise, etc. And those are not incorporated in WPI. We have moderated the WPI, but the people feel the rate of inflation remains very high. You can go to consumer price index, but consumer price index also has only 18% weightage of services. Therefore, it still does not incorporate the full amount of services. And lastly, the black economy is very large, and what happens in the black economy does not get incorporated either in the WPI or the CPI, and therefore our inflation indices are grossly out of line with what the true inflation in the economy is. So inflation is persistently high. Current account deficit, inflation, fiscal deficit, all these have created problems for us. So in other words, if we have an external orientation, then we are unable to take care of our internal requirements. And I think that's where the real problem is. So space for independent policies has been limited by this external orientation of our policies. And that's why, in spite of repeatedly Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia or the Prime Minister saying that we'll control inflation, RBI Governor, and we've had a large number of policy prescriptions in the last 2.5 years from the RBI. We've had monetary policy changes, but inflation has persisted, current account deficit has persisted, and in fact increased as the oil prices and gold prices have increased, and so on and so forth. So the question is, what should we do? And this is where I'd like to point out that the global context of the world economy is very important. 2007-8, the worldwide economic crisis emanated from the world of finance. As we all know, the subprime crisis began with the housing markets, where the derivatives and others, they came into problem. And this was a basic crisis of capitalism, the first crisis after the 1928-33 depression. The depression of 1928-33 was a fundamental crisis of capitalism, and then the second crisis is now. Even though Hyman Minsky, the great monetary economist, had pointed out that a bubble is building up in the financial sector in his paper in 1977. But when 1987 stock market crash came, he was asked, is this the crisis? And he said, no, it's going to be much bigger. When the 1997 contagion came and the stock market crash came, again he was asked, is this it? And he said, no, it's going to be much bigger. And indeed, 2007-8 crisis was the real major crisis, and therefore it's a fundamental crisis. And this crisis is because of lack of trust. Financial markets work on trust, but trust had gone. from the financial market. And that's why, as Mr. Devender was pointing out, we had massive influx of liquidity into the markets. Roughly $1 trillion a year, $85 billion a month was being put into the quantitative easing program of the Fed, and other central banks also received massive liquidity. But that was not being given out as loans because there's lack of trust. Who do you lend to, because you may not get the money back? And therefore, financial markets which work on trust, they have been in trouble. And that has not yet really fully recovered, and that's why the world economy remains in trouble. The world economy, as you know, in 2010 was showing green shoots. That is, it was beginning to come out of the recession. But by 2011, the Eurozone was back in recession, Japan had slowed down, China and India started slowing down, the American unemployment rate was not responding, remained very high. So in other words, the global economy was showing very, very anemic response to the problem. So the second problem that came after the financial crisis of 2007-8, starting 2010-11, was a political problem, not a financial problem as much. Why? Because we had inadequate stimulus in the economy. As Krugman and Stiglitz have shown, in 1933, the size of the stimulus was much larger than the size of the stimulus that was given in 2008-9. And that's why Krugman and Stiglitz had argued that this would not be enough to take the world economy out of the recession and the depression that it is going in for. So in other words, the Eurozone, why did it go back into a crisis? Because it's for political reasons, 28 nations are together, there's lack of coordination in policies, you can't coordinate the fiscal deficit across, and that's why you had problem after problem from Greece to Ireland to Portugal to Spain to Italy, and even France was affected. So the Eurozone was in a problem. The US economy was in a problem because the Democrats and the Republicans could not agree on the size of the stimulus and what the stimulus needs to be spent on. So therefore, in a sense, the problem now was political. How to coordinate the world economy. In America, how to coordinate between the Democrats and the Republicans. That's why you had repeated crises where the budget has not been approved and there's been a gap in spending by the government, and the government almost shut down for 28 days recently and once earlier in three years back. So there's a problem is political. What politically should we do to restore the world economy to where it was? And all this has affected India and China, because China especially is very export dependent, and as Eurozone declined, US economy did not respond, Chinese economy has been slowing down for the last 10 quarters, and so has the Indian economy been slowing down. Now, another aspect of the growth process that we see since that period is that there is non-inclusive growth, especially from the mid-1970s. Inequality in the world was very high in the 1920s. Okay, that was even before the Depression. And after that, following the Keynesian policies that were adopted from the 1934-35 onward, inequalities declined globally. But these Keynesian policies faced a crisis of stagflation in the mid-60s, mid-70s, and then from then on, the monetarist policies, the neoclassical policies, they started coming in, especially from the time when Mrs. Thatcher came to power in 1978 and Reagan came to power in 1980. These are called Reaganism and Thatcherism. With the advent of Reaganism and Thatcherism, inequality increased, and therefore the Census Bureau data of the US for 2004-05 suggests that inequalities have become greater than what they were in the 1920s. And that is the reason why there was a shortage of demand in the world economy. Now, how did we make up for the shortage of demand? The shortage of demand was made up by growth of paper wealth. Stock market prices increased, financial market prices increased, and therefore there was paper wealth being created. But as you know, in the year 2007-8, the total size of the derivatives market and other financial markets was close to about $800 trillion, whereas the world GDP was $64 trillion. So if you gave 10% return on $800 trillion, you'd have to pay $80 trillion to these things. Okay. But the world economy is only $64 trillion. So how did this market sustain? By reinvestment of the profits rather than taking it out. Because if you started taking the profits out of the financial market, you would not have enough money to pay that $80 trillion. So therefore, it was a feeding bubble. And that is precisely what Minsky had pointed out in 1977, that this bubble will build and build. Now, there is no resting place. The moment it rests, your rate of return becomes zero, immediately you start withdrawing and it collapses. So while, like a balloon, it goes up slowly, but if you prick a balloon, it will deflate suddenly. That's precisely what happened. And therefore this kind of a bubble created the financial collapse that took place. Now, following Reaganism and Thatcherism, there's a neoliberal framework of free markets. And as Alan Greenspan said, the free markets work best because markets are self-correcting. That was a new philosophy, that markets are self-correcting. There's no need for government intervention. Let the markets grow. And along with that came shadow banking. Shadow banking is what created the problem in the financial markets, and the state retreated strategically so that it did not have to take care of what is going on. So in other words, post mid-70s, the challenge to capitalism ended as China took a 180-degree turn after Mao's death. Deng Xiaoping said that how does the color of a cat matter? All we need is growth, whether we get it through socialism or capitalism. So China did a 180-degree turn, Soviet Union started declining, and therefore the West was sure that the challenge to it was over. And once that was there, it started coercing the developing world. So up to 1990, you talk about aid, but after 1990, you talk about capital flows. And to get capital flows, you have to give concessions. So the major Bretton Woods institution, the Trinity, GATT, the GATT, World Bank, and the IMF, which were the arm's length institutions for capitalism to dominate the world, which was set up in 1944, they started playing a more active role. So for instance, Mr. S.P. Shukla, who was our ambassador in GATT in 1982, he was told by the American ambassador that now we'll get your agriculture market open because we have agriculture surpluses which we need to export. So for the first time in 1986, the new issues were taken up. What were the new issues? Trade in agriculture, trade in services, TRIPS, creation of WTO, GATS, and so on. And all these institutions, so that you could get the markets of the developing world opened up. Now, so what was the philosophy that started coming in? Firstly, if you look at Southeast Asia, it was not an example of free market. So it was an example of market-friendly state intervention. So the policy that was suggested by the World Bank were market-friendly state intervention. But then the 1997 collapse came, and when the 1997 collapse came in Southeast Asia, the contagion, then you went in for growth at any cost strategy. And growth at any cost strategy means that the burden falls on the workers and burden falls on the environment. And that's why in Beijing Olympics, you had to remove half the vehicles from the roads because the pollution levels were so high. So pollution levels have increased, and that marginalizes everybody. So growth has become more and more marginalizing in the recent last 30 years. So what are the philosophical underpinnings of this kind of a growth pattern? And the underlying philosophical underpinning is that today we are based on marketization as a strategy. Now remember, markets have always existed. What is a market? It's an institution for exchange. I give money and I get service or I get a good. There's nothing else. So market is an institution for exchange. But marketization means the penetration of the market philosophy into institutions, the social institutions and so on. And that is what has happened. So for instance, all the things that were free goods of nature like air, water, etc., they are also getting increasingly marketized. Coastal regions are also getting marketized. And what are the principles underlying this marketization process? The first is, as Samuelson in his basic economics textbook says, it's the dollar vote. So what is the dollar vote? It means if I have $1, I have one vote. If I have $1 million, I have 1 million vote. So in other words, it's not a democratic institution where there's one person, one vote, but it's a question based on who has how much purchasing power. And what does this result in? It results in the marginalization of marginal. So one American with 40 times the per capita income of an Indian equals 40 Indians in the market. And no wonder the US dominates the 2,500 institutions of global governance, whether it's World Bank or IMF or WTO. In fact, there are special provisions. So in the International Criminal Code, only the Americans cannot be taken, everybody else can be taken. In the WTO, there are Super 301 and Special 301 under which the US can set its own law, but nobody else can do that. So the marginalization of the marginal has taken place at the global level, at the national level, and at the regional level. For capital, what does Maharashtra mean? Bombay, Pune belt and Bombay, Vadodara belt. It does not mean Vidarbha, it doesn't mean Sholapur, Kolhapur. For UP, for capital, what does it mean? Ghaziabad and Noida. It doesn't mean Banda or Kanpur, which has got deindustrialized. So in other words, capital will focus where demand is. And therefore, the dollar vote is very important as far as the markets are concerned. Second principle is consumer sovereignty, that is, consumer is sovereign. So individual demands, there should be no interference in the individual's demand. And therefore, if you need cigarettes, you need narcotic drugs, market will supply it, either through smuggling or whatever the market, as long as there's demand, it will be supplied. So markets have no value as such. And the notion of market efficiency is that whatever the consumer demands, that should be supplied. So the notion of efficiency of the market is not the productive efficiency, but the allocative efficiency, as we economists argue. And that's why today there's no distinction between a luxury and an essential good. So all goods are goods. Food is not just essential good. Cars are not luxury goods. All goods are goods. So the distinction between essentials and luxuries is gone, and the government should not intervene, so should not fix prices, should not give subsidy. So this is all part of the neoliberal philosophy based on marketization. Now, the next principle which is very important for a modern day economy is more is better. More is better means if I have one shirt, a second shirt, my welfare goes up. If I have one car, a second car, my welfare goes up. If I have one house, a second house, my welfare goes up. So this is the underlying basis of consumerism and therefore of environmental degradation. So in other words, consumption was always there, but consumption has turned into consumerism. So you have consumption for the sake of consumption. So we have one model of, say, a cell phone, and a new model comes, I want to switch. So you see huge lines of people wanting to switch from i4 to i5 or i3 to i4. You know, whereas your i4 or i3 can work just as well. Your software keeps changing every few years, even if the same old software could work, because you want to be one up. So there's one-upmanship that is associated with it. And therefore sacrifice is no more a virtue. Because if you sacrifice, you're stupid. So what is the plaque at Ukhrul in Manipur, where the Indian National Army came up to it, says we have sacrificed our today for the nation's tomorrow. So nations are built on sacrifice, but today's sacrifice is no more a virtue, and you have to enjoy yourself. So advertising is used to promote consumption, and in that you use sex and violence. Why? Because that's where the man is the weakest. So markets will weaken it, create dissatisfaction. You are unsatisfied, so you consume more. Okay. So weakening of man is a part of the market process. And this has an impact on children and on society, but that is immaterial because of the market functioning. So we are all atomistic individuals rather than being collective. So we are alienated from society. And the elite in India wants to link up with the global elite. The concern with the average Indian is marginal. So we should get 24-hour water in Delhi, we should get 24-hour electricity in Delhi, but in Bankhedi there's no water available, doesn't matter. That's not progress for me. If in Salem, some town there's no health center, that doesn't matter because I want good hospitals here in Delhi or Bombay or Calcutta. So today conscience has to be minimized because conscience is a cost in maximization. So don't have a conscience. You know, do what you want to do. Don't think of the long run because conscience is a long run phenomenon. So in that sense, markets are amoral and immoral. So today, declaring a high profit is a sign of a well-run company. But do you get your high profit through cigarette selling, which causes cancer, or do you get it through De Beers, which sells blood diamonds? That is immaterial in the market. So today, for instance, in Thailand, the Thai baht, when it collapsed in 1997 and sent 1 million people below the poverty line in Thailand, that is immaterial because Hathway Fund and Berkshire Fund, etc., made billions of dollars of profit. So if the market allows you, that's justified. So market is the feature that has to be there. And therefore, today there's a new international division of labor between clean and polluting technologies. And Larry Summers in his 1992 paper, and you know who Larry Summers is, he was the chief economist of the World Bank at that time, later on the chief economist of US, he was the president of Harvard, he has been in the government, and so on. Larry Summers wrote a paper in 1992 which leaked out and came out in the London Economist of February 10, 1992, and there he said that if cancer is to come, where should it come? Of course in the developing world. Because it's 150 times more efficient for people to die in the developing world than in the developed world. People lose 5 years of life in the developing world, but 25 years of life in the developed world. So it's 5 times more efficient for people to die at the age of 55 in developing world. And because the income is 30 times more, so 5 into 30 it becomes 150 times more efficient. Now, this was very embarrassing to the World Bank because it came out in the London Economist, highly discussed. And therefore the World Bank couldn't say that this paper doesn't exist, but said this paper is for discussion. But that illustrates the market thinking. Because it ended, the paper ended by saying, if anybody disagrees with the logic of this paper, they should leave the World Bank, because that's what the World Bank program is all about. So in other words, people become numbers as far as the market is concerned, and that's why they're amoral and immoral. So today, market has become objective and society is subjective. So objectivity is what we go for, so markets have advanced, society has retreated, and that's why there are no values. Values are becoming less and less, and it is becoming very difficult to take a stand in society. So this brings us to the question of prospects for sustainable growth, which is the topic that you have before you. The economic, political and social systems have become all very unstable in the world. And that's why you have one after the other a crisis. The financial crisis came in 2007-8. Then you had the revolt by 99% against 1%, as Stiglitz argued. This is a social upsurge globally, whether in the Arab countries, today you have in the Central Asian republics, you have the corruption movement in India, you have the movement in Thailand, you have a large number of movements springing up, suggesting that there is a social upsurge that is taking place. There are many wars going on all around India, whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Lebanon, etc., which is creating a very unstable situation as far as the Indian neighborhood is concerned. Civil strife is going on in Bangladesh, Thailand, and many other places. And underlying all that is what? The clash of civilization hypothesis that the America has been operating on from 1996. Huntington had this famous book called The Clash of Civilization, and that underlies a lot of American policy where Islam is seen to be a threat. And India is supposed to be incorporated in that, but that has led to the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, and the other wars that have been taking place in the recent past. So, in other words, conservative forces all over the world have been on the rise, and they have created a problem. So, prospects for inclusive growth in India, if we go for growth at any cost, it is marginalizing the majority, and therefore it cannot be inclusive. Black economy results in non-inclusion, because black economy is concentrated in the hands of 3%, and it has become the main cause of inequality in society because it's concentrated in the hands of 3%. If you see this graph, I've shown that India has been losing 5% rate of growth as a result of the black economy. Today the black economy is roughly 50% of GDP. When Professor Kaldor came in 1955, he had estimated that time for it to be 4 to 5% of GDP. So today they are generating 55 lakh crores of black incomes every year. It's not a stock figure, it's a flow figure. So there's a huge amount, and this lowers the investment productivity. Okay, so black economy is like digging holes and filling holes. You make a road, you don't put enough tar, it breaks down. So therefore, what do? You keep repairing the same road rather than building new roads. So what is digging holes and filling holes? The typical Keynesian short-term prescription. You dig a hole during the day, you fill it up at night. So next day, you have 2 incomes but 0 production. So this is activity without productivity, and large part of the black economy is like that. There's activity without productivity. You go to the courts, 5 people come from each side. The judge says next date after 4 months, 10 people go away, no work done. You go to the government office, people are milling around, the work is postponed so you can extract a bribe. So large part of the black economy is activity without productivity, and therefore it results in a large amount of productivity, and therefore it results in a large amount of problem. And as a result, it results in failure of policy. You send money to the ground, very little reaches there, so education target, your health target, your various other targets are not fulfilled. So failure of policy in India, failure of planning in India is linked largely to the black economy. Either way, therefore it's marginalizing growth that takes place as a result of the black economy. Now I've taken too much time, so I'll come to the conclusions. India today is marginal in the world affairs because our GDP is still less than 2% of the world GDP. In India, the poor are marginal to policy makers, and that's why the obvious does not happen. What is the obvious? In the last 40 years since my active career, wherever I've gone in any seminar, nobody says that we shouldn't have education, we shouldn't have health, we shouldn't have poverty. Everybody agrees, but still these persist. India has the largest number of poor people in the world, the largest number of malnourished children in the world, largest number of people without toilets. So we have a situation which is very uncivilized in the world, and it's not that we don't have the technology to solve the problem, but it doesn't happen. Partly it is non-inclusive growth because of black economy, partly it is because our policymakers don't have the emphasis on it. And here I'm reminded of this Said's book, okay? What does he say? In the 50s, in the Congress party, there was a discussion. The landlord class did not want education for the poor children. Okay, because they said if children get poor, the poor people get education, then who will give me free labor? And I found this when I quit my physics at Princeton. I didn't know what to do. I went to do rural development for 1 year in Hoshangabad district, which is the most backward area, one of the most backward areas of India. And there, the landlord told me, "Don't teach these children. If you teach these children, who will take my bhed bakri to the fields?" So this is there in 77, not just in the 50s. So emphasis on education, we've never crossed 4% of GDP on public expenditure in education. Okay. Whereas we need to probably go to 10%, which is what Malaysia did, which is what Thailand did, and that's how they brought in literacy into their economy and so on. So in other words, we need to emphasize on policy and make the obvious happen. And today the world economy is passing through a high degree of uncertainty. So we need more liberal policies rather than more conservative policies. Without that, we are not going to have democratization of the global institutions of governance like the United Nations, the World Bank, the WTO, IMF, etc. So because we are talking about global governance and global sustainability, we are talking about global public goods like climate change was mentioned by Mr. Devender. Okay. All that can be tackled only through democratization. Otherwise, there's too much conflict and that will not allow things to become inclusive. We need to stop interfering in other nations' affairs. We have seen the problems in Afghanistan, in Iraq, from both places where the US is withdrawing after creating a problem, and this problem will fester. The colonization of the Arab countries created the problem in the Muslim-dominated countries, it created problems in the other colonies. So it's interference by the advanced nations in the developing world which has been creating a problem. And with globalization, as the integration has been much greater, these problems have only got compounded. Unfortunately, today there is no global society to enforce global equity, and that's the major problem. So how do we create a global society? That remains a challenge if we are to take care of these things. Thank you very much.
For the eye-opening speech. Now I take the honor and proud privilege to introduce our chief guest, Mr. B.K. Chaturvedi. Mr. B.K. Chaturvedi was appointed by the Union Government as Member, Planning Commission in June 2007 and subsequently also as Member, 13th Finance Commission, November 2007. His experience is both rich, multifaceted and includes both government and corporate world. Mr. Chaturvedi had a major policy-making role in initiating and building economic reform measures across several sectors. He has published several research papers on public administration and governance. May I now request Mr. Chaturvedi to kindly deliver the keynote address. Sir, please.
Mr. Jaipuria, Professor Arun Kumar, Mr. Narang, my former colleague, Mr. Vinod Malhotra, Madam Principal, distinguished guests. You know, the beauty of the seminar is that it enables you to see different points of view. So you heard a point of view from Professor Arun Kumar. Maybe my point of view is going to be slightly different. Let me start, first of all, by dwelling on I have tried to dwell on two issues quite separately. I will start, first of all, with the global crisis, how it started, and then move over to India's inclusive growth, issues relating to inclusive growth, what are the challenges and how we feel we can move forward. It's quite clear that the whole crisis started, as distinguished speakers, Professor Arun Kumar, Professor Narang pointed out, with the US, because the problem was that they had overreached themselves in the financial market. They had created instruments, securitized mortgages, and there was no underlying security in the process. So when the whole thing started with the Lehman crisis, they tried to put a lid over it. It wasn't possible. That was sometime in 2007. And then gradually it spread over. The contagion was quite strong. It spread over to the European zone. The European zone had major crises, as Professor Arun Kumar mentioned: Greece, Portugal, Spain, Many of these countries, particularly Greece, it started, or Ireland, Greece, they had borrowed from the banking system. They were not in a position to pay. And the unfortunate part was that when the European Union or Eurozone was formed, they were supposed to stick to certain norms of fiscal deficit on borrowings. Unfortunately, while they are nation states, so you can agree, but the nation states are nation states, their parliaments are supreme, so therefore they went ahead merrily borrowing from the market and from the banking system. With the result that the banking system came under stress and there were worries on debt default. They were supported, of course, by Germany, France. Germany, of course, comparatively stronger economy. The IMF, they had the packages. And in Greece, when it was pointed out that you must tighten your belt and you must reduce your expenditure, you are spending too much. You don't have the money, you don't have the income, so you are spending too much. There were changes in government. People were not prepared to accept. There were demonstrations that we would not accept this tightening of belts. Nevertheless, this there has been in the recent past gradually an improvement in the system. In the Indian and the East Asian economy, like others, as was mentioned, we started with the fiscal stimulus. India and China also, China gave a huge fiscal stimulus. We also gave a fiscal stimulus. And interestingly, while the economies of these countries during this period continued to record, the Western economies recorded a very low growth or even a negative growth. In fact, amongst OECD countries, Japan recorded negative growth according to IMF data for 2 consecutive years. US recorded negative growth, and the global output also continued to grow at a very short pace at that point of time, particularly in 2008, 2009, 9 in particular. India and China recorded very high rates of growth. In fact, China recorded around 9.5%, 10%. India recorded also at that point of time rates of growth of around 9 and 10%. So one thought that perhaps we had got over the hump and there wasn't really need for any such measures. But perhaps we did realize that ultimately the money must chase some physical goods. They must chase some production. And it was realized that our fiscal deficit finally became so much that it became unbearable for us, our economy. So government appointed an expert committee. We had former Finance Secretary Dr. Vijay Kelkar. We appointed a committee. And even prior to that, as a member of the Finance Commission, I remember we had recommended, and both Vijay Kelkar was also a member of he was the chairman of that commission. We recommended a certain path of fiscal rectitude for the government, going up to 3% fiscal deficit by 2015. Unfortunately, this wasn't followed because in between these events had overtaken us, and then again a fiscal rectitude path was required. That is now being followed across the board. It has really led to tightening of belts. The planned expenditure really has not grown as much as one would wish it to be. But the fact remains that gradually we are able to bring fiscal deficit down from around 5.86% to somewhere around 4.8% maybe in the current year. Also, we found that we were having unmanageable current account deficit. Now, if you have a current account deficit, that means that finally you may not be able to meet your requirements for foreign exchange, for your requirements of the economy, for imports. So, while experts recommend Paris Express recommended that 2.5% is the norm. Our current account deficit had gone to more than 4%. The result was that a correction. So rupee, which was around, it was clearly thought that as the US started its threat of tapering the quantitative easing and said that look, no more, that dollars were no more sort of available as were earlier, and so dollars started strengthening and rupee started getting weaker, and there were corrections. The corrections led to from somewhere around 50 odd to around 62 rupees, which is where 62, 63 rupees, where the rupee is. The point which is being made is that while in this global crisis, the Western nations had serious problems, and the global crisis is still, in some respect, is still not fully out of the woods. Still, there is a slow recovery in the Western world. The India and China in particular managed it better, but its impact subsequently reflected on India, on the Indian economy, and we had to therefore make corrections within our situation. This only highlights the fact that today nations of the world are highly globalized and very well integrated. Let me give an example of India. In the 1990s, India had 12.7% of its GDP, only around 13% of its GDP. And the international trade, both export and import, formed part of that. In 2012, it is around 42.5%. This only indicates that our integration with the world economy has gone up now, much more. We are much more dependent on them and they on us. Our integration with the world economy is far more than what it was earlier. And therefore, if we thought earlier that we are not really, we have only around 10 to 15% as part of our world trade, and therefore, since our domestic demand is the major driver of growth, and therefore we can do with domestic demand, that's no more true. Whenever these crises occur, we will get affected by that. So the answer to that therefore would lie in trying to work out in the long run our domestic demand more, and trying to move over to the markets which are less, have a less of contagion, and in particular the Asian markets, particularly markets like China, in the Asian region. It will be, as it is, India has a large support from that, but it will be useful to work on that. Before I come to the inclusiveness of growth and my prescription for the inclusiveness and some of the issues which have been raised in today's debate, let's see how has India done in respect of inclusiveness in the last decade or so. I will especially confine my data in respect of most of this to 11th plan, which is from 2007 to 2012, but some of it also relates to slightly prior periods of maybe 2000 to 2010. Data shows that the per capita income in India, which was around, it shows that the growth which was in the initial period between 50s to 80s at around 3 to 3.5% increased to between around 5% to 5.5% in the 80s to 90s. Between 80s to 90s, between 90s and 2000 it grew further, and between 2000 to 2010 we grew at an approximate average rate of around 8%, which is fairly high as compared to the previous regimes. In the last 2 years, the growth has again slid down to around 5%, 5.5%. That's the level. Yesterday, the data came for the last quarter, and that was 4.9% for this quarter. So, which is again coming up. We have to now work out how we can move forward and come out of this and back again to this high growth path. The income per capita in India, which was in 1990, in around 2000, was $457. In 2010, it was $1,419, 3 times as much in a period of 10 years. So this is a substantial increase in income over any decile. The expenditure and the amount of consumption, especially in the rural areas, also went up. Data shows, the 11th plan data shows that, which is based on, this data is based on the National Sample Survey data. This shows that the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, which is called MPCE, in the rural areas, in 1993, 94 to 2004 and 5, grown at a rate of 0.85% per annum. Between 2004-5 to 11-12, it grew at the rate of 3.4% per annum, 4 times as much as it grew in the earlier 10 decile. And if you read the plan and see for different deciles, for the first lowest 10%, 0 to 10, next 10 to 20, you will find that practically for most of the deciles, this growth in consumption took place in the rural areas. The number of people below poverty line is another yardstick of how growth is taking place. There have been a lot of debate on where the poverty line should be drawn. The fact is that if you want to make measurement, draw at X, you may draw at X plus delta, you may draw at X plus double delta, X plus triple delta, but you will have to draw a line somewhere. The Tendulkar committee drew a line at, earlier there were several committees, the Tendulkar committee drew a line at some place and tried to measure poverty. Now based on that line, 37.8% of the people were poor in 2004-05. This number came to 22% in 2010-11. And just to recall, this number was 45% in 93-94. So if you see, in spite of the population increase from 93-94 till 2011-12, more than 130 million people came out of poverty line. And let me mention that the fact is that when you draw these lines, gradually there is a realization that poverty can't be static. Poverty in US can't be measured in the same way as poverty in India, because as incomes rise, you must revise your poverty line upwards. People must partake of it. Let me give you an example of this thing. An interesting example. Way back in the 1950s and 60s, I had joined service. And at that point of time, someone said that I am below poverty line. The image in one's mind was that he, of course, doesn't have adequate to eat anyway. But also he doesn't have electricity in his house. And if electricity is given, it is, he will need a bulb. That will be quite adequate for his needs. That was the conception then, because they have such a large number. This sensitization, this needed to change. It has changed over a period of years. Recently I went to West Bengal, and there is a scheme, what is known as Rajiv Gandhi Vidyutikaran Yojana. I went to the West Bengal and I asked them to show me a village where the village had been electrified. So they showed me a village which had been electrified, and I asked the people, is your village electrified? And they said, yes, it's fully electrified. But sir, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He says, you see, whenever we have major key television programs, the electricity goes out. Now this was for the below poverty line connection village. My point is that below poverty line is no more that concept. Below poverty line now looks to mobile, which he will try to put. Recently I met a delegation from Seva. Number of women came around 2022 and they gave me a presentation on solar lights. And then they said, sir, this is our lights, and this is, and they showed me one lead, and from which there were 8-10 types of leads sticking out. So I asked them, what is this? They said, sir, you know, we have different mobiles with us. So therefore we have got these 8 leads that you can charge your mobile anyway, whichever it is. The point I'm making is that this concept of people in that gradually is changing, and this must necessarily change as incomes rise. So again, as I said, that there was a criticism nevertheless that we must revise this poverty line, and committee had appointed committee Dr. Rangarajan, the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, to make a fresh set of recommendations to suggest where the poverty line is and where should it be drawn. The question was that large number of villages were unelectrified. During this period, last 1 year, they electrified around 1 lakh villages. NSSO data shows that you were able to, in this manner, provide additional connections to around 259 million families during this period. Provide electricity. This is, NSSO data asks, do you have electricity? Do you get? I don't vouch for the quality of electricity. I don't vouch for the type of connections given, but this is what the data shows that they have done. But as I said, it's a way of looking at it. One way of looking at it is 259 million people came. Another way of looking at it is still there are 330 million people who do not have access to electricity. And it is these which should be a cause of worry for us. For these we ought to be working. 259 people got, good. We take note of it, feel happy about it, but that's the end. Now we must start working for those 330 million people who don't have access to electricity. Similarly, in case of LPG connections, we got a very large number. I have the numbers here. They have put in the, I think they are put in later. So, but broadly the position is that around 60%, NSSO data shows 2009, that around 60% in the urban areas had LPG. In the rural areas, this number was as low as around 15 to 20%, very low, very low. Many of the people in the rural areas still cook their meals with the biomass and with poor quality chulas, which is extremely harmful for the women. Large number of deaths of women because of asphyxiation because of this. Let me come to the another part of inclusion, the telecommunication. In 2007, there were only 20.6 crore people who had connections. In 2007 March, 2012, instead of 20.7, this number went to 95.1 crores out of a population of around 20 crores. So, I don't know whether you will call it inclusion or exclusion. In my definition, this is what inclusion is all about. The second question is that there has been a large criticism that Bimaru states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, these are sliding. It was mentioned, and recently we had this case in Delhi about an Arunachal boy being lynched by people because we are not really sensitized enough to Northeast. And since I do look after Northeast and I keep going to Northeast every now and then, almost all the states I look after and I visit them quite often. I do feel very sad about that. But the point is that if you see there was a point of view that these states will never be able to catch up with the rest of the country. During the 11th plan, the rates of growth of these states was around 8.8% as against the national average of 8%. There was, in respect of rates of growth, a slight convergence. But this only goes so far and not further, because the per capita income is a function of rates of growth and the rates of growth of population. Unfortunately, many of these states had a very high fertility rates, with the result that though these rates are also coming down as against the southern states. So while this convergence was not reflected in the per capita income, there was a positive sign that this was being reflected in the state domestic products growth. In the Northeast, the average growth of the states, 8 states we have including Sikkim, the average growth was 9.95% as against the national average of 8%. Sikkim had a growth rate of 22% per annum. All the states of Northeast recorded higher growth rates than in the earlier plan periods. The point I'm making is that increasingly now we found that the Northeast also was trying to catch up, and in many cases their per capita incomes were also equally good. Where have we failed? In the health sector and the education sector. In the health and education sector, we tried to give large outlays. I remember when we were preparing the 11th plan, around 19% of the expenditure was on education. And in the 12th, we have tried to increase it on health. The norms are that we would like to increase it to as high as 6%. Professor Arun Kumar was saying 10%. I don't know whether 10% would ever be feasible given our resources, but okay, at 6%, which is also fairly high. We have not been able to get as much, with the result that even though we have been able to get some advantages, our net enrollment ratio is more or less now, we have most of the children in the school, though there is a heavy dropout, but most of the children are at the primary rates going to school. The infant mortality rate, which used to be, I remember I used to be secretary of the Department of HRD, and there I also looked after the Department of Women and Child. And at that point, I remember the infant mortality in somewhere around 2000-2001 was 75. Today it's gone down to 44 and now gone to 42. It has gone down, but not enough. In respect of health and education, an important measure is how we fare in the Human Development Index, which measures most of the nations of the world, and what is our ranking. Our ranking has continued to be very poor. We continue to languish at around 135, between 120 to 135 during this period, and we have not been able to improve our ranking. Part of the reason is that initially, when we were around 120, after that 14 more nations came in the reckoning who would also wanted to be, many of those are small nations, very, very small sized nations, and they were much better placed. So they also came and became part of this process. So these nations became, instead of 172, 184 nations, 171 to 184 nations. 184 nations are being measured on this Human Development Index. There we found that the Indian position continues to be around 135. That is a cause of worry. Another cause of worry for me is the quality of education being imparted. This is a very major cause of worry as far as I see in the educational system. An assessment was done by an organization which is the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. They did an assessment. This was for 15-year-old school students, pupils, scholastic performance. Now, two of the best states we have today in the country where education is focused is Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh. So from our country, these two states participated in it. When the ranking came, we found that out of the 74 regions participating in PISA 2009, these two states beat only Kyrgyzstan in the ranking. Otherwise, Kyrgyzstan was 74th, these states were 72 and 73 in the ranking of learning in education. These subjects studies are three: science, mathematics and reading. These three subjects were there. In mathematics, this was in the reading section. In the mathematics, out of the 74 regions participating, the two states finished again second and third to the last, beating only Kyrgyzstan. In science, the results were even worse. Himachal Pradesh came dead last, 74th, behind Kyrgyzstan, while Tamil Nadu inched ahead to finish 72nd of 74. We did not participate subsequently on the ground that these test methodology really was faulted, and I think we need to look at this methodology once again. But the point I am making is that you may shoot the messenger, which is the one who is telling you that you are doing badly, but it doesn't really change the fact that our learning levels are bad. You take the ASER report, again an independent organization which does the studies, and they have found that the students of class 5 cannot do sums of mathematics of class 2 and class 1. Very large number of them. Now again, this reflects on the fact that we are really not doing very well in respect of our learning levels. So recently, we have also tried to introduce this no tests, nothing. It brings too much to the students, too much stress. So quite often I feel very worried that no tests, no stress, so no learning or learning, but it will reflect when they reach BA levels or BSc levels or management levels. Then it will suddenly start flowering. I don't really know the answer. But to me, it is important that children are tested and they realize that the learning has to be done. And the teachers, and the responsibility, I must say, lies squarely both on across the country, the students, and across the country, teachers. Another level where in the education system we have really done slightly differently was in the expansion of education in the university education, technical colleges, medical colleges. We expanded it pretty fast, which was good in a way because I found that in the UP there were only a number of universities and that they remained the same for a long, long time. But this resulted in a sharp deterioration in the quality of education. There were cases where the same faculty was notified for a number of medical colleges, same faculty for engineering colleges, notified, and they said that look, partly I teach here, partly I teach there, and I teach for so many hours there, and whatever be the explanation they gave, I don't really want to understand. But what I do want to understand is that this, in my opinion, is a very poor way, because unless these institutions of learning, they provide good quality, we cannot really move forward. I must say that one of the important points when we talk of India's growth, when we had from Goldman Sachs telling how India will do very well by around 2050, and we will exceed we will be, with United States and China, we will be the 3 economies of the world and maybe cross even in US. One of the points was that there will be a demographic dividend. Demographic dividend meant that we have a very large young population, but we have a smaller older population. So the working age population is very large, and these people will have skill sets, and they will be working, and therefore they will bring in incomes. And when they will work, the rest of the world will have shortage of labor. So maybe some of this labor could move forward over there, some of the labor we would provide employment here. So we would be having a demographic dividend. Suddenly it was felt. But this demographic dividend can become a demographic disaster if we do not teach and improve our learning levels. A body of young persons, ill-trained, uneducated, no skills, and just saying that we will be employable, I think it will be a terrible thing for the country. So this is very important that we focus on this, and in this plan we have the National Skill Mission. We must work on this, but in my area, in this plan and in the next plan and in the next plan, this is an area we need to focus on very strongly. What is it that we feel that needs to be done so that we can move forward in this manner, and what is it that I feel we need to be doing? But before I come to that, let me give a slight counterpoint of view to this business of ranking of the HDI. As I said, that in the ranking we are 120 to 135. Fine. But if you see the absolute numbers of our index, our index has gone up from 0.34 to 0.54. If you take countries whose index has gone up by this much, which is around 62%, I think South Africa, Brazil, most of the countries did not really increase their index that much because the fact remains that we started in the 1980s at a very low level as far as HDI was concerned, and when we therefore moved over to this thing, we had a lot of distance to cover, and we have taken our own time to cover. But other countries have moved faster in covering, and therefore they have done well. But this gives hope that the fact remains that in the index value we are moving forward. So let it not be a point that as if when we go down in ranking, we go down in most of the performance levels also. And ranking means that it's a relative thing, rank, but even then we have a 0.54, and the question is that now we have to keep moving on that a little bit more. Let me now highlight the set of issues which I feel we need to do to come out of this, continue with this inclusive growth, and how I see the global economy coming. First of all, it's quite clear that the global economy is now gradually coming forward, coming out of the woods. Slowly though, we have the point of that it's coming out. The global output, if you see the IMF data, does not indicate a very sharp increase, but it's coming out slowly. You see the US economy, that also is coming out slowly. The European economy is somewhere around between 1 to 2%. It's very slow growth, but it is just coming out of this thing. Now that should help us because, as I said, our economy is much more integrated. But having said that, what do we need to do now in case we are to move forward and we are to sort of get inclusive growth. In my opinion, one of the cardinal principles of inclusive growth is that your per capita incomes must increase. If your per capita incomes increase, then the size of the cake is bigger. So whatever you distribute, even if unfairly, let's put it that way, that if you were to take the inequality measure, which is the Gini coefficient, which has gone in case of India, certainly, because the model we have adopted, the Gini coefficient has gone up. Though one must say that models which China has adopted, their Gini coefficient is umpteen times higher than us and much more than US. But that's no consolation. Our Gini coefficient has gone up and we need to work on that. But the fact is that there is no way, no short way but to increasing our income, and our growth rates must go up. So this 5% won't do. We must now go from 5%, revert back to the path of 8%. Now how do we do that? In my opinion, there are 6-7 measures required which will help us in doing this. First of all, developing infrastructure. Roads, port, rail, all this, we must invest on this. Many of these schemes, many of these projects have been held up for one reason or the other, court cases, instability, political problems, CAG, CBC, whatever you call it, but many of these projects are held up. I think we must move forward and improve our infrastructure. This is an important key of growth. Second, governance. We must improve our governance levels, particularly address questions of corruption. We must realize that the governance is one which ensures that how much money is flowing, which you are spending to the people. It ensures that the productivity of the capital is good. So in the governance, in the plan, we have given a whole lot of set of measures we suggest, and I don't want to take your time in reiterating those, but the fact remains that we must improve governance. Without this, governance today is a central key issue today in our growth process. If we do not improve our governance, then I think, I'm afraid, we should then not think of India becoming, just now we became the third largest economy in the world. In the PPP terms in 2011, overtaking Japan. Japan was the third largest. In the PPP terms, we became the third largest. That time we were the fourth largest. So we may become the third largest, but very soon we will see the decline will continue at 5%. There is no way we can continue positions, and no way we can provide all these benefits which I mentioned. So governance is again critical. Third, we must address on the questions of two important questions which also related to with this thing, which is the questions of environment and questions of land acquisitions and land related issues. We must also questions about stimulating private investments. My experience is that in 2004 we were doing infrastructure. At that point of time, private investments was somewhere around 4% or 4.5% of the GDP. Today, it came to 7.5% in 2011. It had gone down to 7%. And we spent around $500 billion in the 11th plan. And we had planned to invest $1 trillion in the 12th plan. 12th plan is from 2012 to 2016-17. But we may not be able to spend all this money unless we improve the question and stimulate private investments. And private investments won't come unless we improve our governance. Our experience is that it is only when the private investment has come that the growth rates have gone up. You see the Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Hyderabad airports. I remember in 2007, we had port capacity of around 700 million tons. Today it is around 1280 odd million tons, double. That's because a large number of private ports came in the states. We had a large number of roads. Also came up in the private sector. In case of power, we used to produce 20,000 megawatt of power every 5 years. And this was for the last 20 years. For the last 20 years, every 5 years, we will produce only 20,000. 16,000, 17,000, 20,000, 16,000. For the first time, in the 11th plan, we produced 55,000 because the private sector came, they came this thing. But the fact is that when the private sector comes, you must have certain regulations. You must ensure the counterpart of it so that the consumers' interest, people's interests are. So the regulatory architecture also must be equally strong. You cannot really have a private sector and have a poor regulatory architecture. There are in the three major issues which also need to be addressed. The issues of water. We are increasingly water deficient. We are finding that large areas we are consuming water very, very inefficiently. We must address issues of water, environment, and energy. Energy, when I say that, I talk of energy efficiency, I talk of energy excess, I talk of energy so that we don't produce so much of coal, we expand more of solar energy. There's a whole set of issues. I don't want to go into those. Second, on health and education, you must have a special focus. Interestingly, we did a study recently in the PAN Commission on what is the correlationship between corruption and HDI, and we found that there was a very strong correlation. The moment wherever the HDI was high, the corruption levels were lower. Wherever the corruption levels were high, the HDI was a very strong correlation. So that's from this angle, but even from other angle, from the, as I said, from the angle of inclusion, from the angle of people participating in it, we must also work on this. We must also bring people in, think that how can we bring people gradually from agriculture to manufacturing and services and increase their income. This is more a policy question, difficult question to address, and maybe in the plan we have mentioned this, so many people, million people will bring out. It will require a large set of broad policies, but I do feel that this will help us then improving the average wage rates both in agriculture as well as in our rest of this. And lastly, we have, as I said, we have 350 million people don't have access to electricity. Only around 20% of the people have access to clean cooking fuel. And the rest are dependent on biomass. This energy poverty cannot continue. We must address this question of energy poverty and this. There are other areas also we have not really done well. Take for example, people staying in the tribal areas or people staying in the left-wing extremism affected areas. In many of those areas, I think we need to make special projects, special plans for them and try and see that these areas come up and feel part of India. As Professor Kumar was mentioning, that if parts of Vidarbha or parts of Gadchiroli, Maharashtra and others don't feel that, or parts of Banda don't feel that, incidentally I was born in Banda, don't feel that we need to move forward, we can move forward. How can they feel part of India? So there's no question that we must work on this. So I do hope that the 2 points of view you have got, one from me and earlier from the other speakers, will stimulate your thought process and you will try to reflect on this and make your own choice. Thank you very much.